Hey, this is Chris. In this video I wanted to talk about something that happened recently when I was watching somebody else's photography video. I was watching a video, I don't remember whose it was, and one of the photographers on YouTube doing film photography and printing and everything. And they were talking about their basic metering technique of using a spot meter to do sort of typical zone system kind of metering, you know, placing the shadows at a certain value and then metering the highlights and figuring out what their exposure was and their development was. And they said, you know, it's kind of a simple field practical version of the zone system they were using, and it was. And somebody in the comments of that video had made the statement that really kind of got me thinking about it. And they had made the statement that so much had changed in the time that Ansel Adams had published the original zone system, so much had changed with films and developers and printing process and everything, that the zone system really wasn't relevant anymore, and that what you should do is learn how to use modern materials and processes to really expound on what those allow you to do. And my initial reaction to that was, oh, that's not true at all. You know, the zone system certainly is still practical. And then I got to thinking about it a bit, and I thought, well, maybe I need to look at what is still the same with the zone system and what has changed, because there are some things that have changed. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. Since Ansel Adams, what's changed in the zone system? What's still pertinent and what's changed a little bit? So first off, I don't want to teach the zone system in these videos. There's plenty of places to learn that. Most importantly, I think, if you're going to talk about zone system exposures and developments and printing and everything, you really owe it to yourself to go back and read Ansel's original descriptions of it. The best book for doing that was Ansel's The Negative. This was the new Ansel Adams photography series. This one was put out in 1981. Really the best one to do. There were some earlier versions that came out even in the 40s and the 50s, probably even printed into the 60s, that were the early, what they call the basic photo series. Those are hard to use because the meters were like Weston meters. They were marked in candles per square foot and all that really early stuff that's hard to use. The 1981 version of the book is what got into actually using Pentax spot meters and EV numbers and the things that we can still use today. So that was the last time Ansel published the zone system, was in The Negative in 1981. The other books that you can learn it from sort of directly from Ansel were in about 10 years later, in about 1992, and then in 1998, the publisher, Little Brown and Company, had John P. Schaefer redo the series. They did 2 volumes that was called the Ansel, what is it? The Ansel Adams Guide, Basic Techniques of Photography, Book 1 and Book 2. There were several years came out between the books. Book 1 covers sort of the basic black and white photo things that are in Ansel's book. Updated a bit to include things like T-Max film, which was not out at the time, and multi-grade printing papers and things which were not out in Ansel's time. It's one of the things we'll get to. The next book that they did, the part 2 of that, was this one. This is the hardbound one. Same thing, John P. Schaefer. John Schaefer was one of the people who founded the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson. And they came out with Book 2. Book 2 is the one that actually has more of the actual zone system techniques in it. Film testing procedures is in here, things like that. And the typical zone system, you know, using characteristic curves and that kind of stuff. The typical zone system things. And a lot of Ansel's original diagrams and photographs are in here, but there are some other ones added in. So I would say if you're going to toss around zone system terms, there's only 2 people, only 2 books that you really should get it from. Ansel's The Negative, and then either one of the later photo books that were John Schaefer updated it and updated a little bit. So we need to go back and look at what the situation was, what the materials and things were when Ansel wrote that last version of that 1981 book of The Negative when he was talking about the zone system. So there's a couple of things that happen in there. One is the films that he's using are things like FP4, HP5, Tri-X, Plus X, some films that aren't around anymore like Plus X. And the film developers are actually still pretty much the same. The HC110, Rodinal, D76, those things. The big difference in Ansel's time that we'll get into is when Ansel was printing exhibition prints at that time, he only had a select kind of paper that he could use. And we'll take these one at a time and go through them. So there's basically 3 parts to the zone system. There's exposure, development, and printing. Printing today can be broken down into a couple different things, which we get into. So let's take those one at a time and what's changed and what hasn't. So zone system exposure. using a spot meter usually to determine subject brightness range, placing different values on an exposure scale. Has that changed or not? In terms of black and white film, no, it has not changed in the least. It is exactly the same thing. When we take a piece of FP4 and I stick it in my 4x5 camera and I get out my spot meter, I'm doing exactly the same thing that Ansel did in not only 1981, but even what he was doing back in the 40s. Different, better meter, but still the same idea. I'm measuring brightness ranges and exposing the film to match that. So that aspect of it, exposure aspect, has not changed at all. Not at all. The next one up is development. Developing our negatives to suit that contrast range. On roll film, we're stuck with the whole roll being the same, unless you're going to cut your film in half or something. And on sheet film, of course, we have the ability to change times to adjust to certain brightness ranges. Has that changed any? Well, no, it hasn't. Film still responds to developer in the same way. The changes that you make are still going to make the same change. If you had a certain film developer combination in 1981 and you did that same thing today, it's pretty much going to be the same thing today. It might be a little bit different because chemical formulations might have been tweaked a little bit over the years, but it's going to be very close. Certainly not to the point where it's completely dismissed anymore. It's going to be quite similar. Now let's talk about the third part of it, because that's where we're going to see the biggest differences. There's several ways to what I call render an image now. Once we have the negative, we can either print it in a darkroom, which is what I usually choose to do. You can scan it on a film scanner, like a flatbed scanner, film scanner, or you can scan it using a digital camera, like on a light box using a digital camera. And even those two are a little bit different. So let's look at what's changed in that process. And actually, let me start with the digital side. If you're taking film negatives and you are scanning them or photographing them with a digital camera to make a digital image out of that negative, that's really quite a different process than Ansel had ever imagined for using a negative for. He was designing negatives to be printed in the darkroom, and we'll get to that in just a minute in a bit more detail. So if you're scanning, there's a whole different situation there, because you've got to make a negative now that's scannable or photographable to get the information out of it. Are the densities of a 1981 version of a negative, are those going to work with a modern scanner? Are they going to work with a camera on a light, pointing at a light box, photographing a negative to make it into a digital image? Those densities may not be the same, and that's something that has changed. So if you're doing a digital conversion of your film, you're going to have to look at, is what used to be considered a zone 8 density on a negative, does that work with my scanner now? Or do I need to cut that down a bit to give the scanner a better chance to get light pushed through that to scan it? Or maybe the scanner's so bright it's just blasting through everything, and you can actually up your levels a bit and say, no, I can use zone 10 now because I got a really bright light box behind it and I'm pushing a lot of light through it. So that's going to change things a little bit. Actually, it's going to change it quite a bit, potentially. So that is something that definitely has changed for the zone system. What we're gearing a negative for, what we're heading it for, if you're doing a digital conversion on it, is not necessarily the same thing as printing. So that's something that's definitely changed. I'm not a great expert on scanning film or digitizing film that way. I have photographed quite a few negatives and inverted them to kind of do digital proofs on them, but that's about as in-depth as I get. But even at that, I definitely have noticed differences in depending what the light source is behind the negative, how much light it pushes through. So that's definitely something that's changed. Now, getting into printing, which is what I do in kind of the traditional sense, I kind of like to keep my traditional film negatives on traditional print materials. So I like to go into darkroom and make prints. And of course, at Ansel's day, that's exactly what he was doing, because that was his own choice back then. Ansel had a certain situation that we need to talk about. When Ansel was doing his exhibition prints in, even the 1970s, late 1970s, coming up to, he passed away in 1984, so even coming up until those final years of his life, printing papers at that time to make an exhibition quality print, a gallery print, which obviously he was doing, really meant you had to use a fiber-based paper, and they were graded papers. They were not multi-grade. You bought grade 2, you bought grade 3, you bought grade 4. When you read Ansel's books, what you'll find is he's taking a negative in the zone system. He's very carefully controlling the contrast of the negative, trying to head it toward a whole grade of paper. He's trying to make a negative that will print on grade 2, because if it doesn't print on grade 2, The only really next thing he can do is print it on grade 3. There's really nothing commercially available in between. The way you got in between in those days was you used a different paper, like maybe a different manufacturer's paper. Grade 3 would be softer than somebody else's, so you could kind of split those grades that way by using a different manufacturer's paper. Or you use different developers. You might use the contrast of your paper and you use a softer, lower contrast developer on it and not let you get something in between. It was just kind of a hassle to do that. In today's world, well, at that point, multi-grade papers as we know them weren't that good. Even up until the 1980s like that, most multi-grade papers were resin-coated papers. They weren't gallery quality papers. And a lot of times the image quality wasn't that good on resin-coated papers back then. It still isn't as good as fiber-based. I'll still stand by that one. Watch my other video. But you certainly didn't have a really nice exhibition quality fiber-based multi-grade paper. It really didn't exist in Ansell's time. If they did, they were rare. They were hard to get. They go back, I think, all the way into the 1950s, the multi-grade papers. But even at Ansell's later years, to get a good quality print, it meant using a really good quality paper, and that was the way you did it. In today's world, things are quite a bit different because we have multi-grade papers. So when we can sit down and print something at grade 2 and realize, oh, that's not enough, and we go to grade 3 and realize, oh, that's all too much. Watch my video on split grade printing. And we can say, okay, I'll do a 2.5 instead. That's a luxury that we have that Ansel Adams really never knew. Not in exhibition quality prints he didn't. He did probably in making prints for books, because I think a lot of those actually were on RC paper. And they did them a little bit low contrast because they knew the book was going to boost them up. So he was doing RC prints, even though you may not admit it. He actually does admit it in his books. That's what they're using for the reproduction. But for exhibition quality prints, things he was selling, putting in galleries, it was fiber-based and it was graded. So in today's world, like I say, we have that luxury that he didn't know. It gives us the ability to change things a little bit. And this is where that person's comment about the zone system isn't relevant anymore. It's basically not right on 2 counts of the 3. But in this count, it kind of is right. Because in learning how to use multi-grade papers and what our abilities are with those, we're able to take the negative that we create in the field, and we still want to carefully meter and expose and develop our negative, but we actually don't have to do what Ansel did and say, oh, I got to get this on grade 2, because if I don't get on grade 2, I've only got grade 3, or I got this hassle trying to get in between. We don't have to be that precise anymore. We can do 2.5, we can do 3, we can do 3.5, we can get in between those if we want. Now, honestly, I think if Ansel had had what today we have Ilford multi-grade classic papers, the multi-grade fiber-based papers that we have, he would have loved that paper, absolutely loved it, because he could have gone in and printed something like Clearing Winter Storm. He could have burned the clouds in at grade 0 for a few seconds. He could have used a grade 5 on that tree in the corner, and he could have used grade 3 or something on the waterfall over there or something, and he really could have divided that up and really been happy with having that control over it. He never knew that. We do. So that's something that's changed. It's not necessarily easy. It may take a bit of printing experience to be able to do those things, but we do have that ability. So what does that mean for our negative today that we're creating in the field? What it means is, even though I want to meter with the zone system, like I said, and expose and develop carefully, we don't have to head toward grade 2 or grade 3 or grade 1 or something. That's a very adamant, regimented thing. We can make a negative instead that falls in between somewhere, and we don't really need to be paranoid about exactly where it falls, what the contrast is, because we can adjust that later a lot easier than they used to be able to do back then. So my take on developing negatives today is, in the field, I like to make what I call a safe negative, where I like to make a negative where I've got plenty of exposure in the shadows so that I don't have to worry about losing anything that I'm not going to be able to get back later. But at the same time, I don't want to take my highlights and push them to, zone 8 on a grade 1 paper or something, because that's going to be a pretty dense part of the negative. What I try to do is make a bit safer negative. I try to make a negative that's a little bit lower contrast, that's a safe negative. I can maintain all my highlight detail, not worry about pushing any of it too high, too dense. But then, if it needs a little more contrast when I print it, I can go ahead and give it that other half a grade or whatever it needs to be able to print it. Very convenient, very handy. because it makes things easier in the field than somebody like Ansel had back then. Frees us up to not worry about exactly what our contrast is on the negative. What we can do is err on the lower side a little bit, which is what I tend to do, and then just adjust for it in the darkroom. There's also another thing that comes into play with the multi-grade papers of today. That's that, as we talked about in the split grade printing video, the modern multi-grade papers have two parts to the emulsion. One part is sensitive to the green light, this low contrast side, and the other part to the blue, which is going to be the high contrast part of the emulsion. What I find in practice is that when we're using multi-grade paper, the best looking prints that I ever make from it, that I'm happiest with, is when I use a contrast on the paper that actually uses both sides of that emulsion. I want a decent amount of the low contrast end so that my highlights have detail in them and work good. And I also want a decent amount of the contrasty part of the emulsion so that I get clean blacks and nice separation in the midtones and everything. That really requires using both parts of the emulsion. So what we don't really want to do is print something consistently that has to print like a grade 0. Have negatives that will have to print at grade 0 all the time, or grade half or 1, way down at the low end. And conversely, we don't want something we have to print at grade 4, 4.5, 5 all the time. We don't want negatives that soft. We want something that prints in between. Ansel's old adage was to head negatives to print on grade 2. Well, he was dealing with graded paper. Again, like I said, grade 2 or grade 3, whatever. I find that on multi-grade paper, I usually end up with a little bit better looking print if I can print more like grade 3 as a basis for sort of my normal negative. Grade 2 would be kind of at the bottom of my normal range. 3, 3.5 would be at the high end of it. I don't really want to go above 3.5 if I don't have to, because that's getting weird when you get up into 4, 4.5. There tends to be a big jump between 3.5 and 4. There's really another couple of paper grades in it. That's where split grade printing does come in very handy. Is between 3.5 and 4. But I try to head my negatives, especially like my current FP4 negatives. I'm the happiest with those when I can print them at grade 3. So that's a little bit different than Ansel's old grade 2. Now, a place like Ilford will tell you that their paper's very well matched across the contrast, that their characteristic curves are very much the same, and that's probably true. But I still feel like you're better off to go for a contrast on your negative that prints with a good combination of the two different parts of the emulsion. And I'm not alone in that. There's some people who tend to agree with that. I was reading Bruce Barnbaum's book recently, and he says that in his book as well. And I know Steve Sherman, who does the power process workshops and everything, he expounds that as well. Don't go to one extreme or the other, but print with a good combination of the emulsions. What does that mean for our zone system negative? Well, it means that, again, we can head for kind of a safer negative, because if we're going to print it at grade 3, like in my case, as a normal negative, that means I need a little bit softer negative. I can't push my highlights real dense. The shadows aren't going to care. As long as I get good detail on those, I can print those at the tonality that I want. But to be able to keep the highlights areas in there, what I need to do is have a negative that's just a little bit softer. But again, see what that is a safer negative. Very convenient. It means if I'm photographing something, I'm looking outside because there's clouds out there right now. If I'm photographing something that has clouds in it, I can expose those clouds and I can choose a development. It's going to give me maybe a little less than Ansel would have considered a zone 2 on grade 2, a zone 8 on grade 2 printing paper. I can do more like zone 8 on a grade 3 printing paper, which is a little bit softer negative. But that's a safer negative, very convenient. So those are some things that have changed over the years. So film exposure, I do not feel has changed at all if you're using black and white film. What Ansel wrote back then is exactly true today. Film still exposes the same way. Developing the film still reacts the same way to film developers. It just hasn't changed any. Printing is a bit different. If you're scanning, you need to head a negative toward what's going to scan correctly, and that's going to depend on your process, whether you're using a film scanner or a camera or whatever. That may change your density that you're shooting for a little bit. And in printing, we have multi-grade paper now, which definitely changes our ability to not need to be so precise with the contrast that we're making in the field. We can make a safer negative and then adjust the contrast for that when we print, and that's probably a good thing to do anyway, because paper's going to like that better since we're using both parts of the emulsion. So anyway, that's my thoughts on what's changed and what hasn't changed since Ansel's published the zone system, at least his final version of it in 1981. If you have any comments about how you apply the zone system and what you feel has changed in it. And I don't have a lot of experience in scanning negatives, like I say. If you do have experience and that's all you do is scan negatives and you use spot metering and development, careful development and everything, leave a comment down below and let me know, let us know what you do. Do the same tonality, the same density ranges, the same zones, do those work with scanners, or do you have to adjust that a little bit? Because like I say, I'm not really experienced in that. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.